Welcome to our second seminar of the term, everyone. It's great to see you. It's a lovely snowy day here in the Niagara region, which I love, but too much snow is problematic for our classes. But I'm glad that you've made it here in person, and welcome online viewers to the class today. I want to start by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Walking Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And this acknowledgement reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. I'd like to welcome today Dr. Julia Baird to our class. It's exciting to have her here. Julia is an associate professor with the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, affectionately known as ESSERC for most of us. And she's also part of the Department of Geography and Tourism Studies here at Brock University. Julia holds a CRC, Canada Research Chair, Tier II, in the human dimensions of water resources and water resilience. Her research focuses on the human dimensions of water resources, and she's particularly interested in water resilience, and we had a reading that invoked some of that interest, and improving outcomes of water governance by improving processes and the role individuals can play in broader system change. So huge welcome to Julia. And I want to note that, we often spend a lot of our time here talking about the individual as a researcher, but Julia is also not just an active researcher, which is valuable on its own, but also contributes quite significantly to the learning of students in our programs. And that's a really important role that she plays, and she has a vibrant lab here on campus. And our students learn a lot from her. So, Julia, without further delay, welcome. Thank you for being a lovely colleague on top of that. And I can't wait to hear your talk.
Oh, thank you. That's very heartwarming. I'm really pleased to be here today. Talking about research is one of my favorite things to do next to maybe doing research and supporting students in their research. So this is a real treat for me, too. Okay, so some big kind of concepts in the title. I'll deal with each of them in turn. And I hope that you found the reading, for those of you who did it, who are in the seminar series, useful as we move through the talk. So this work happens not as an individual researcher, but as an enormous team of people. And so I just want to acknowledge before I get started, all of the people, I hope I've captured everybody that has contributed to this work in some way, including many at the center, many students, past and present, and also non-academic partners that are now playing a role. So there's a lovely list. They've all been really essential to moving this work forward. So thank you to them. All right. So sometimes when we think about us as individuals and system change, it can feel pretty overwhelming. And I'm sure that you've talked about this in other classes or maybe had this feeling yourselves of what can I do as an individual? It can feel like the whole world is doing one thing, you want to be doing something else, but you don't know if you can actually make a difference. And so sometimes we start to question, why bother? There's my little graphic of my one person in a crowd who's feeling that feeling. And I know I felt it too. And I think it's quite common for those of us who work in research related to sustainability, to environmental change, that sometimes the news feels very overwhelming. Public opinion seems to not be in our favor. And we really do question what we can do as an individual. But I think this talk will hopefully be a good news story on that front. But in addition to that, there are things that we can do as an individual. So I'm going to just flag a few of them for you. The first is vote. My daughter is learning how to use Google Slides right now, and so she played a role in my animation today. I kept her at just one, so you won't see the spinning for all of the options here, but she thought it would be pretty cool if I could have one of those in my talk today, so that's for her. The second, protest. So there's things that you can do publicly to push against something that you feel needs to change. You can communicate with elected officials. That can happen through writing letters. It can happen through phone calls, meetings, public meetings, that sort of thing. There's lots of ways that you can communicate with elected officials. We can educate children on kind of the science and social science behind change. And we can have one-on-one conversations with those around us. And this can be extremely effective. There's a whole network science around how ideas spread through networks. And you as an individual actually have quite a lot of power in affecting how those around you, those that you're connected to in various circles, actually think and act. So hopefully that's a little bit of encouragement. It's not just me saying this. There's a growing body of literature around this idea of individuals as a source of broader system change. And if you haven't been introduced to the idea of leverage points, welcome. It's a wonderful world. And it is this theory of how change happens in a system. This idea of leverage points, and there's 12 that were initially proposed by Danella Meadows in the late 90s, that kind of range from being relatively easy to implement. So I saw this pointer stick and I just have to use it because it's so like, this is like something from my primary school days. But I just for this. Really kind of relatively easy things to change, but potentially having less leverage. So the potential for system change is lower, likely. All the way up to things that can be really, really difficult to change, but have huge leverage potential for system change. So Danella Meadows proposed these 12 leverage points on this kind of spectrum from shallow, what we call shallow, so easy to implement but less effective, all the way up to quite deep leverage points on the very end. And since then, that idea has been taken up and kind of further refined, developed by several scholars, including many out of Leuphana University, and Hannah knows that one well, where we start to group these leverage points into different groupings. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about leverage points today, but if you're interested, Google Danella Meadows and leverage points, and there's a very nice essay that comes up that's quite easy to read and sets out these 12 in some detail. What I want to focus on is the kind of highest leverage points in this list. They represent, they've been called different things: intent, inner worlds, the personal sphere, but essentially this idea that how we understand the system, including understanding it as individuals, can really have an important impact on system change. And I think intuitively, we can understand that that makes sense. The way that we think about how the system works, how we understand our own role within it as humans, as decision makers, can, create a suite of options for how we make decisions about the world. So the suite of decisions really is, if we understand the world as separate components that we can manage individually, of course, the options that we consider reasonable to address a problem will align with that understanding of our system. If we understand it as a social-ecological system, which I'm sure, being in sustainability science at the graduate level, this is a concept that's familiar to you. then the suite of options might be quite different. We understand that the world is highly interconnected, it's complex, it's uncertain, and so the suite of options is really different. And so thinking about, this, how we understand the system as individuals and how that translates into how we act and the sorts of decisions that we make is a really interesting area of research for me, personally. And I guess the other part that's good to know up front is that my focus is largely on water. So why water? Well, we need water. Humans need water. Ecosystems need some amount of water. And water globally is in crisis. Water in Canada, even though we see ourselves as very water rich. I love this quote, Canada is a water rich nation. We are not a water secure nation. So water is relevant to us in this moment. And we know that climate change is impacting water in terms of where it's located on the globe. It's impacting its quality, access for those who need drinking water. There are all sorts of implications of the water crisis globally and also in Canada. I'm not going to read this out, but Global Water Futures wrote a really nice report on Canada and water and the kind of impending water crisis here. So that's where I focus my research largely, is in this area of water. And when we think about water and decision making, it's good to think about what sorts of attributes of water governance are important, given that we're in this moment in time. We're in the Anthropocene. We know that we have a disproportionate impact on our globe, and we know that we operate within a social ecological system. So there's a few things that are important to think about when we think about what decision making should look like. It needs to recognize that water is part of that interconnected social ecological system. It needs to recognize that uncertainty is certain, so we will never know exactly what's going to happen and when. We're living with some degree of uncertainty all the time. And acknowledgement that multiple and interconnected voices and authority will govern more effectively and adaptively. So we can't do this all, one entity can't make all the decisions about water. That water is connected to so many other things, so many other issues, that we really need to be working together. And we need diverse voices when we're making those decisions, not just those of a specific group or population. So if we accept that that is true, that this is what we need, then water resilience is an approach that aligns with those needs for water governance. And so I use water resilience a lot in my work. You've likely heard the term resilience before. You may not have heard the term water resilience before. And there are different interpretations of how we think about water resilience in the literature. How I use it is very much in line with a social ecological resilience understanding. So it's the capacity to adapt or transform in the face of change in social ecological systems, particularly unexpected change, in ways that continue to support human and ecosystem well-being. And this comes from a few different authors. And we added a focus on water systems in particular. So when we think about, this idea of capacity, what does that actually look like? Well, adapting is the ability or capacity to adjust or change how a system, responds. A little too much automation there to maintain the same function over time. So adapting is changing in response to or in anticipation of some likely changes to the system, whereas transformation is kind of much more kind of all-encompassing change. Major shifts in how resources, authority, and power are structured and interact with the system. Usually this happens in response to a major disturbance, but it can also be planned. And ideally, transformations don't happen as a consequence of something, but are kind of planned and carried out in advance of any major need for a transformation. Okay. So water resilience is a pretty big idea, and it's useful to break it down into some kind of component parts. And there's various ways that this has been done in the past. I tend to really like the kind of principles for building resilience in social ecological systems that Unsi Biggs and colleagues developed more than a decade ago now. That's just one of those moments where you're like, oh, I remember reading that when it was new. So there are these 7 focal principles, and some of them relate to social systems and ecological systems, and some of them are really focused on governance. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these, but I will just briefly touch on each of them. The first is to maintain diversity and redundancy. So what that means is that you don't want everything to be very homogeneous within a system. You need some differences. And that's the case in ecosystems. We think about how we need diverse species in order to maintain an ecosystem function. You don't want just, one species of fish in the ocean or one predator on the landscape, because that's not going to work out very well for that species or any other. And also some redundancy. So I'll use a social example for that. This maintaining diversity and redundancy, though, applies equally to ecological systems and social systems. So redundancy is this idea that if something is to fail, there's something else that can take its place. So if you think about like a governance system, if there's one person that's holding a whole network together, and that person leaves the network, what happens to it? You really want more people that act as strong connectors within that network. So if one person leaves, it's not the end of the world. It's, maybe there's a couple of holes that need to be filled, but it's the network still maintains its integrity. Number 2 is managing connectivity. Again, a social ecological system principle. So we need connectivity in ecological systems. I think we know that. You think about species habitat corridors are a great example of connectivity in ecosystems, and networks, a great one in social systems. Managing slow variables and feedbacks, things that change slowly over time. But over time, those changes accumulate, and then all of a sudden, it feels like all of a sudden, but it's not really, we can see a major shift in something. And phosphorus in water is a great example of that, where it slowly builds over time. But when it reaches a certain point, it can have major impacts on freshwater quality and the viability of that system for it to function. The remainder of the principles, 4 through 7, are really governance related. So I really love number 4, fostering complex adaptive systems thinking. So it's this idea that as individuals, even as like systems, if systems can think, that we understand the system is complex adaptive, that it's dynamic, uncertain, self-organizing. Because that, again, as I said earlier, that sets out how you understand the system, which sets out the suite of options that you see as potentially addressing system issues. Number 5, encouraging learning and experimentation. So this idea that we need to continually adapt, and sometimes we have to take some small risks in order to be able to do that. So being open to trying new things, learning from that, changing how we operate in the future as a result of those experiments. Number 6 is broadening participation. So including the diversity of the voices that we include, the perspectives that are included in decision making or governance. And finally, promoting polycentric governance systems. So this is, polycentrism has a few characteristics of it. It means that different decision-making bodies are connected across different levels. So from, if you want to think about the province of Ontario, you have municipalities, you have a conservation authority, you have some provincial agencies that might be relevant. And having connections among them is important, so they operate at different levels. But also connections within levels. So, municipalities talking to each other, for example. And if we have this kind of system that is connected across and within levels and kind of clusters around maybe certain areas of authority, that's a way that can really be supportive of water resilience, water sustainability in the long term. Okay, so now you know about the resilience principles. We use these in our work, and so it's important to have at least an introduction to them. All right, so with all of that kind of background information, this is the big question that we're really trying to answer. If individuals hold agency, so you have some power, some way in which you can influence broader decision making. And how we think about the system, our attitudes are important. How do we shift attitudes to align with water resilience? So that's, we have to start somewhere. And where we started was by understanding what individuals' attitudes were. Because we didn't really know, like in the general public, how do people think about these resilience principles? Not that most of you probably do think about resilience principles, but you probably have some ideas about what you would like to see or what you would definitely not support, if it was a decision made about water. And so what we did was set out some vignettes, which are short scenarios that really just describe in brief a water issue. And then we ask a series of questions related to that vignette, and the questions aligned with the 7 principles. So we would give them some options. I should have put an example in here. I'm sorry I didn't, but if it was a flooding vignette, then there might be some options around connectivity, saying flooding should just be managed where the impacts are, versus flooding should be addressed at all levels of government. That's a very simple example. We tried to be a bit more nuanced than that, but that gives you an idea of they had 4 options that represented kind of varying levels of support for each principle. And we asked a bunch of people a bunch of questions, really. We did this through a third-party data provider. So there are companies that provide respondents for surveys, and there are pros and cons to doing it that way. For us, the pros outweighed the cons. So we had, these data are from Canada and the US, and they are from, I think, 2018, 2019. I think it was about 250 people per country. And we asked all of our questions and then assessed their responses based on the 7 principles. So they go from principle 1 up here down to principle 7. And what we found overall, when we looked at all the data averaged together, we found it was 2.85 on a scale of 1 to 4. So that's kind of like moderate to good support, or what we called endorsement, for the water resilience principles. And that was really, really encouraging. And frankly, a little surprising, because we don't hear these sorts of stories a lot in the news. And so, of course, our curiosity led us to continue to ask these questions. But just so you get a sense of kind of where everybody was at, the colors here represent different levels of endorsement. And for some, you can see there's more options for the top 3, because we asked a socially oriented question and an ecologically oriented question for those. And sometimes the responses for the social and the ecological question were different, so we had to average those. So there's a bit more nuance in these top 3 than in the others. But what we find is that, the no endorsement is fairly low, less than 20%, and, the kind of high endorsement on the far end here is, it's quite striking, especially for, for these social principles. So yes, very encouraging. And there were some things that came out of that, and I'll talk about them in a second, because we didn't just ask about water resilience principles, we also asked, I'd like to say we took the kitchen sink approach to collecting data on psychological traits as well. So we were interested in if there was anything about the person that would predict how highly they would endorse water resilience. And there are some things. And we'll get to that in a minute. So obviously we're super kind of excited about what came out of the Canada and US data, and so we wanted to expand our investigation to more countries, because we know that Canada and the US do not represent the totality of the globe. And so we ended up, the paper that you read was one that's based on data from 6 countries, Canada and the US still, but because partly, we wanted to test whether that those original findings held in another study, but then we also included the UK, India, South Africa, and Australia as additional countries. And there were some practical reasons for that. But we did try to increase the diversity of countries that we were including, especially thinking about global north and south. And what we found was, again, moderate to strong support, 2.87 on a scale from 1 to 4. Super exciting again. But we were able to tease out a little bit more, of the variability and why we maybe saw some variability. Country of residence mattered a little bit. So there were some differences depending on where the respondents were from. And there was a little bit of an effect of personal experience with the topic of their vignette that they received. So if they received a flooding vignette and they had experienced flooding personally, they tended to support or have a stronger attitude in support of water resilience than if they hadn't. But that depended on the country of residence. That wasn't consistent across all countries. So there's more work to do there, I think, in terms of the role that personal experience plays in our attitudes on this front, at least. And these are still ongoing questions, because we're not done really analyzing and writing up the data. So the paper that you read for this class is the first one that's being published out of this 6-country survey. We have at least a couple of others that we're interested in publishing that dig into some of these details in more depth. All right. The most exciting part, the part that I just I get giddy about, we determined that there's potential for improvement. And we actually wrote a piece in the conversation last week that talked about this and tried to get that message out to more than just academics. So part of the design of the survey was such that if you got a vignette and you had 4 options, the first step in answering a question about that vignette was to select all the options that you thought were okay. Like, I could accept this option, I could accept, this one and this one. So you might choose, oops. Yeah, okay. You might have chosen 3. So in this example, they chose the low, moderate, and full expression of the resilience principle. Then there was a second step where we asked the individual to rank those in order of preference. So they had, oh geez. Maybe my daughter did some additional little tweaks while I wasn't around. So they could rank them however they wanted. So you put, your top choice first, and then going down, okay, I'll try to get through this fast so that we can get on to the chicken picture, because apparently that's where we really need to be right now. But essentially, what we found was that, you know, the full expression of the principle wasn't always ranked first, but if it was in there and not ranked first, we interpreted that as an option, as an indicator that there was room for somebody to actually eventually rank that as their top option. And so 62% of respondents had at least one situation like that within their survey responses, and we thought that was really, really exciting. And kind of gives us the next step in our research. So what predicts those attitudes, and how do we maybe use those predictors as a way to improve the attitudes, or build stronger kind of supportive attitudes towards water resilience? And what we found was that there were two predictors that stood out to us. After the first study, it was empathy and self-efficacy, and I'll talk about those in a second. After the second study, empathy. Even across 6 countries, empathy was one of the only, and certainly the strongest predictor of attitudes across all 6 countries. Statistically significantly strongest. So, empathy, I'm going to talk about at length, but self-efficacy is the belief that one has the capacity to accomplish a given task. And we can kind of see where that might fit in, right? Like it's kind of this idea that you as an individual can affect change in some way, that you have the capacity to do what you set out to do. And so, not entirely surprising, but certainly exciting. There's a graduate student in the program right now who is looking at self-efficacy, but the work that I'm doing right now and that I will focus on going forward is on empathy. Okay, so once we found that, it was like, okay, what exactly do we do next? And what we decided ultimately was this idea that we would really hone in on this idea of interventions. That there's things that we can do that can influence attitudes and eventually, hopefully, also influence decision-making, governance. So we have 3 really big questions. What we're working on right now is the first one. How do we build empathy? Then there's some others, and these will be addressed over time. But other questions include, does increased empathy relate to changes in attitudes? So we know that the level of empathy people have relates to their endorsement of water resilience. But if we increase empathy, does that mean that they'll actually increase their endorsement of water resilience? We don't know that for sure yet. And finally, do changes in attitudes lead to changes in behavior? And that's the big kind of, aim that we're working towards here. But we'll start with the first question. What exactly is empathy? I had a little description under the chicken there before, but I'm going to give you a fuller explanation here. The answer is it's complicated. As with many concepts in the literature, those of us who work with them like to develop our own definition. We like to question others' definitions. And so there has been a long debate in the empathy literature about how you actually define empathy. And there is no one definitive answer on that. So, right, as of 2014, this was a review by Cuff and colleagues. They identified 43 different definitions of empathy. So, what you have to do when you're working with a concept, and there are all of these different definitions, is you have to decide for yourself what makes sense for us, for what we want to do. And so what makes sense for us is to define empathy in kind of terms of 3 parts. Cognitive empathy is like recognition or recognizing that somebody else is experiencing an emotion. So a good example of something that would indicate cognitive empathy is I can easily tell if someone else is interested or bored with what I'm saying. And if you want to test your own empathy, I can share a little online empathy assessment tool that you can maybe circulate to a class or something. You can see where you land on the empathy scale. It's not the same scale that we use in our work, but it's online. It's used a lot, and it's just more for fun than maybe for rigorous academic work here. The second one is empathic concern. Actually, I'm going to go to affective first. This is the idea that if somebody else is feeling something, that you feel it too. So I feel the same way as others I encounter. If they are happy, I feel happy. You could also substitute that with if they feel sad, I feel sad. But these cognitive and affective tend not to be oriented towards just negative emotions. They're kind of emotion neutral, can be whatever emotion. Whereas empathic concern in the middle really is focused kind of more on that concern factor, so more in response to negative emotions. This kind of arises as a result of cognitive and affective components of empathy. And there's a lot of discussion about whether empathic concern is actually a part of the definition of empathy or not. We've decided to include it. So it's this idea that you are concerned for others when they are in distress. All right, so it gets even more interesting because empathy has kind of manifests in two different ways. So you have this empathy that is kind of inherent in you and sits within you all the time. And that's called trait empathy. So it doesn't usually change very much. But there's also this idea of state empathy, where that's in response to a particular situation that you encounter. And state empathy can actually vary quite a lot. All right, so empathy is complicated, but also very, very interesting. And we were interested in, as a starting point, once we have this definition of empathy that works for us, to think about how we might go about building empathy in others. And when we want to learn how to do something, it's good to know how it's been done in the past. Because there is this huge body of literature that focuses on empathy from all sorts of disciplines, from clinical practice to kind of therapy to rehabilitating criminals to caregivers of children and those with developmental differences. There's just a whole range, very, very broad literature on empathy and how we might intervene to increase empathy. So we started there and got ourselves into a project that ended up being enormous. We started with over 6,000 articles that addressed empathy interventions in some way. Landed, I think, just over 100 or 170, I can't remember now. Jillian Dale would be able to tell you exactly how many papers we finally included in that review. And now what we're doing is looking at how those interventions took place, what they found, how successful they were or effective they were, we're trying to distill out the best interventions for enhancing empathy in others. This is ongoing. It has been ongoing for more than a year, but we are getting close now. And I'm very excited that I can share some preliminary results that have not yet been published, but hopefully before too long will be. What we know so far is that there are kind of three ways of building empathy that tend to be more effective than others. So we started off with a whole range of potential interventions, from mindfulness meditation to therapy to taking different drugs, whether legal or not, And where we ultimately landed based on this systematic review and now the meta-analysis is that education about empathy, what it is, what it can do is important and can be very effective. Training, so engaging in some sort of kind of participatory training process where you learn how to be empathetic is very effective, and role-playing scenarios. So actually putting yourself in the shoes of someone or something else also is very high in effectiveness overall. And we find that often there's combinations of these three. So they're not necessarily discrete interventions, they're often combined in some way. So a training exercise may have an education component and it may have a role-playing component, but not always. So this is really where we're landing, is that these are the interventions that seem to be most effective and the best chance for success. So what we're aiming to do with this is to develop our own interventions and start to test them. And that is the kind of job for 2024 in this project. Okay. So this is just kind of to summarize everything, hopefully, succinctly that I've talked about today. It's a lot. We'll start at the top. How we govern is critical to water sustainability. We need to align how we make decisions about water with how the system actually kind of, operates, a social ecological system perspective. Everyone's understanding of the system is important, including us as individuals. And because it guides how we understand the system and the sorts of actions that we take. We've started to identify some key predictors of water resilience endorsement, empathy, self-efficacy, and places to intervene to increase it. So we know that we can build empathy. Empathy is something that can change in people, just like self-efficacy. Where we're going next is to kind of develop and test these interventions to actually try to enhance these attitudes for water resilience. And our hope is that where that leads is to stronger water resilience endorsement, which, as we know from that leverage points theory, holds a lot of potential for broader system change. So we're hopeful. This is a long journey. It's a program of research, not just a project. But very encouraging so far, and really looking forward to what the future holds for this work. And I will just do the final thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here, those online. Thanks for this opportunity from your instructors, and to everybody who was involved in the project, including funders. And there are a few of them listed there. So thanks.